On this episode of Do Stuff, we'll be installing an NESRGB into a top-loader NES for a cleaner, sharper picture. We'll also be installing a multi-out jack so that you can use the same cables as you would with your Super Nintendo or N64. For more information on the mod, check out the links in the description below. For this project, you'll be needing a game bit to get the console open, a smallish Phillips screwdriver, a soldering iron, as well as some thin solder. You also need some desoldering tools, so I used a desolder pump. You can also use desoldering wick as useful, or if you have it, a desoldering iron would be probably the best choice. You'll also be needing some good quality wire. Since we are still working with analog video signals, the quality of the wire will affect the final video output quality. And of course, you'll also be needing your NES RGB board, the adapter plate for the top loader, and the multi-out jack. There's links for all of those in the description below. Let's begin. So first things first, flip this over. There's 4 screws that we need to take out using our game bit. Alright, that's all we need that thing for. Should be able to pop this thing off now. Here's the inside. As you can see, here's our NES RGB already installed. Goes all the way back to this fancy jack. First thing you're going to want to do is get the motherboard off so that you can get at the underside. This is actually the original PPU. You're going to save that, but it's actually attached down here. So there's 1, 2. The other one is actually under this. Okay, so this is where that PPU would be. There's another screw over here. And then these 2, there's one on the other side as well that hold the cartridge thing in place. Those are longer, so they're a little bit easier to keep track of. I will say also, one thing that you did not see in here is when you open yours up, there's a big metal shielding piece on the top that matches this one on the bottom. I don't have that because once you install the NES RGB, it doesn't fit anymore. So I have it somewhere, but there are a couple of screws for that that you're gonna have to take off. I think it actually screws in the same spots if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, that's all for getting the motherboard off. You can kind of set this part aside now. So the PPU, which looks like this, is this one right here. It actually says PPU. I can't really zoom in on that, but that's what it says there. So you need to get that off. And the way you do that is you come in to the bottom and you're gonna need to desolder these. If you've never done any desoldering before, I will caution you, it is an annoying pain in the butt when there are this many pins to desolder. So look up some videos on that, maybe practice on something else first if you've never done it before. But essentially what you're gonna do, and I'm not gonna walk through all this because I've already done it, is you're gonna take your soldering iron, heat up your joint until it melts a little bit. You're gonna prime your pump once it's melted, and you shouldn't be holding it here this long, honestly. You're going to do this, whoop, push the button, sucks it up. It works better if you have this secured somehow. As you can see, it kind of shifts around when you do that. Be careful while you're doing this. Fortunately, these solder pads actually go all the way through, so even if you mess up one side, which I totally did on that one, you can still fix it because you can get connection on the inside. So it's not a terrible idea, but you do want to make sure you're not leaving the soldering iron on there too long, or you can damage the PPU by overheating it. So, like I said, practice makes perfect. Do that. Once you've got that desoldered, you're gonna set the PPU aside. There's also gonna be, over here where this thing currently is, there's actually an RF modulator there, and the power jack, which are both going to be removed. In the case of this particular kit, it includes an extra power jack, so you can just get rid of the old one. That is connected here. Well, the RF modulator, I should say, is connected at the end there. It's connected here. It's connected at this hole here. I've actually got a wire running through there right now, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then we've got this other hole that's currently filled, and that one. The power jack is connected here and here, and then these three right behind it there. So you're gonna desolder all those, and it's kind of a pain, especially with the RF board, because it's a giant heat soak. So yeah, it'll be a bit of a pain, but you can do that. You're probably also going to want to take off this entire shield on the back. So in order to do that, there's one screw there. There is one screw here. And there's one more screw for that on the inside. I hope you can see this. It's maybe a little bit dark. There is a regulator, and there's a screw there that you're going to disconnect. So you're going to unscrew that one. Set that aside. And now this just pops right off, so we can set that aside. So this is that regulator I was talking about. It screws to that. Cool. So now we're essentially where we need to be. I'm going to show you a couple things here, though. Okay, so next step basically is assembling your NESRGB board. So the first thing, there is an adapter plate for it. And the instructions that are on the website are pretty clear about this part. So you're going to take these pin thingies, I can't remember the name right now. First thing you're doing is soldering them to the adapter plate. He suggests putting them in this socket holder there first, which is a good idea. So you solder this to the board first. At this point, honestly, if you gave up, you could put the PPU right back in. It would work just like your original NES, but we don't really want that. So put your pins on this. You're gonna put your, what's the next step? Next step is attaching pins, and goes in to the NESRGB board here. And the reason why we're doing that part next is that after you've done that, there is another socket, one of these, that goes on the top to put the PPU in. Next step is attaching pins to the other side of this. So that solders here. Make sure that you're doing everything in the right direction. It's pretty clearly labeled on the board. You can't see it here because it's covered, but much like it is here, there's a little notch on one end of the PPU. You can see that there, and you want to make sure that lines up with the notch on the socket and the notch on the graphics. And then that is pretty much it as far as assembling the NESRGB goes, but there's a couple things that you're going to want to do here. So before we even get to these wires, there's a couple jumpers on here that you are going to want to solder. If you're using an NTS board or NTSC board like we are here, jumper number J3 is soldered. That one uses the standard regulator from the board. Since we're using a top loader, that's okay to use that power regulator. Jumper number J5 up here is soldered. That one is because we're using an NTSC Where's the other jumper? Actually, that's all that you have to do. The jumper J8, which is over somewhere. What the hell is that thing? It's over here, hiding. That one selects between what type of composite sync you're using. So the TTL is the open mode, which is standard, and then there's also a 75 ohm mode that he says is recommended, but if your cable already has that built in, which I think the SNES RGB cable does, there's not much point. So I left it open for now. If it doesn't work, I'm gonna go back in and solder it later. Last thing I did, because I didn't care about selecting between different color palettes, these pads here are where you would normally go in and solder your switch to select between the palettes. I just put a little piece of wire here and jumpered number 3 to the ground so that I always have the, I think they call it natural, which is the standard NES style palette. And that is it for the connections of the board itself. So we're good. I think that I may, okay. Next step is going to be to get these wires. So all that we're going to use for our standard setup is, you can't really see these, but I did it just these ones in the middle. So there's a ground one, there's one labeled C, that's for the chroma output, that's part of your S-video signal. There's one labeled Y, that's your Luma output as part of your S-video signal. Those are both encoded from the RGB. There's one that is labeled V, that's your composite video output if you want to use the one encoded from the RGB rather than the original composite signal. Then there's B, G, and R for blue, green, red. Those are your RGB signals. And the last one that you're gonna have to worry about is the one that's labeled CS #, which is for composite sync, C-sync. So that's what we're gonna use. Make sure you've got one of the ground wires connected as well. We don't need to worry about PPU-V is our original one. I'm not really sure why there's a second ground. It's not necessary. The plus 5 volts is, I believe, if we're using the external power regulator, which we're not. And these top 3, there is actually a sound chip on the NES RGB board as well. So you would splice out of the original one, go into this, and then go out of this. So let's see, it's actually in from A and B is how you do that, and then this is your output is the O. I didn't bother with that. I'm fine with the standard NES sound, so I just left that as is. So now, I'm gonna stick this back in the socket. Cool. I probably should have made these wires a little longer, but I didn't, so whatever. So those wires all go onto our jack here. So on the jack, they are helpfully labeled basically the same things. Hang on, I'm gonna look at my cheat sheet here. So they are labeled by number, and on the site where they come from, it's labeled what they're for. Number 1 is your red, number 2 is green, number 3 is your C-sync, 4 is blue, 5 and 6 are ground. You don't have to use both, you can just use one, they're wired together anyway. 7 is Luma, 8 is Chroma, those are from the S-video over here. 9 is your composite video, 10 is plus 5 volts, which comes actually from the bottom of the board. I'll show you that in a minute. And 11 and 12 are for left and right audio respectively. I just have left audio selected or wired at the moment because this only outputs mono anyway. As long as your TV or whatever is able to interpret a mono signal and still send it out both speakers, which I have not had any problems with so far, you can just leave it with the one connected. But if you run into problems, I would just jumper the two of them, 11 and 12 on the end there. And then you'll get audio out of both signals. One last thing to note, this screw right here is actually backed out a bit on mine. The reason is if it's all the way in, you are not able to get this flush with the board there. So I had to back it out a little bit, and then I just screwed it down just enough so it's making contact with our ground plane there. So I'm gonna flip this over. There's two more connections we gotta make, and that is on this side. So the first is this little orange wire is our power connection. This is pretty well illustrated on the diagrams for our jack here, our socket. But that connects to a little solder spot in the middle of this trace that Nintendo rather kindly put there for us to just solder something to. And this one is coming from our audio, and that goes, there's like a row of pins here, and then there's one just above right there where you can put that in, if you can see that. And that's it for our audio. When I first wired this up, I thought that that was just, you just were supposed to go from the output of the NESRGB to the audio there, and that worked. That's where common confusion for me, I think. That only works if you're using the onboard audio amplifier, which requires you to take audio traces from, I think, actually the sound chip itself somewhere in here and wire those to there. Personally, I thought it was more of a pain than it was worth. So I just left it alone, which means that we're not using the audio connections on here. You'll also have to go in and solder in your new power jack. And then you can just screw this in, same spots where the RF circuit was originally screwed in. And then you're good. At this point, you can probably plug it in and test it just to make sure it works before you put it back together. It's probably a good idea. Once you're sure that it works, just gonna reassemble everything in reverse order here. So you'll notice actually there's a little gap on the back here that these wires can run through. It's pretty nice of them to do that for us. Going to sorry, it's a little hard to do both of these. I'm just gonna put that in loosely for the moment while I get this all lined up. Come on. All right, there's one side. There we go, make sure I don't strip the screws. Okay. Get that on there nice and tight. Get our little screw. Don't forget to solder our regulator back to that. The reason that that is, did I say solders? I meant screw it. The reason that it is like that is that the shield, as well as being a handy dandy RF noise shield, also works as a great heatsink for our regulator. So pretty handy, fortuitous for us. So I left this on the bottom. Like I said, the top one doesn't fit anymore, so you can kind of just set it aside. You don't have to worry about that anymore. If you really wanted to, you could go on the underside of this and probably line it with some conductive paint or like copper tape, and then get that soldered to one of these just to make sure you've got a connection. I haven't run into any problems yet, so I think you're probably fine not doing that. But again, if you're that sort, have at it. So next I'm going to do the long screws here. Make sure sure that's good and tight. Do this one over here. This is where it comes into play that I didn't really make these wires long enough. Just a little bit longer would have been better. I think ideally you want these wires to be long enough to actually go around and under this. Mine unfortunately do not all do that, which means that this green one is getting a little bit pinched and I need to be very, very careful. The reason that it happens is that this pushes down on them. So I suppose if I wanted, maybe I will do that. Could sort of cut a hole or something on one side there to make it a little bit nicer. Whatever, I'll worry about that later. I'm gonna screw the motherboard back in. So there's one, two, and then the third one that I always forget about being there is, come on, screw. Of course, under the board that we already put in, but thankfully it's got a socket, so it's real easy to take in and off. Come on. Don't want to strip anything. Cool. That's basically it. Gonna reattach this. Alright, well, we'll worry about that later. As you can see here, I run into a bit of problems on mine because of that little extra bit of cable there. Alright, so you want to make sure everything goes together nice. Should be nice and even along here. Stick our weird game screws back in. Thanks for that, Nintendo. Wouldn't want to make it too easy for us. Don't crank them down too hard. Don't want to strip anything. Bloop, 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 bloop. And we're done. We now have a fully RGB modded top-loader NES with our handy dandy Nintendo multi-out for composite, video, S-video, or RGB output, and that. You can also get this colored more gray. I didn't really care. It looks pretty stock, didn't have to drill any holes, unlike with the standard things that come with the NES RGB. So we're good. It was a lot harder than I thought. Thumbs up. Now that we've got the board installed, check out this other video I made comparing the different video output options it gives you. Thanks for watching.